Zimbabweans are so disillusioned by the current government to even wish that the colonizers were restored into power. You can just imagine the level of being useless your government can be, to the point where Africans want the erstwhile colonizers to come back into power. So you know Ian Smith, who literally said it's impossible for a black man to run a country. The same man who said and declared that never will a Zimbabwean or a black person run Zimbabwe in 1,000 years. Yes, that is the man some Zimbabweans are wishing they could have as the leader. Anyways, in recent times, there is a narrative that has emerged among Zimbabweans suggesting that the era under Ian Smith's leadership was more favorable compared to the current government. Now, to critically assess this perspective, it's essential to examine the historical context, the achievements, obviously the challenges of both regimes. So in hindsight, it is imperative to note that many Zimbabweans do not like the current government, and clearly its achievements are close to none or nothing. However, comparing the Smith regime to the current government is a whole different game. But let me not say much, because I want us to take a closer look at the achievements on both sides. But before I go there, let me focus on the main character, Ian Douglas Smith. Now, Ian Smith served as the Prime Minister of Rhodesia, which is modern day Zimbabwe. And during the reign of Ian Smith, Rhodesia became an unrecognized state that declared independence from Britain in 1965. Now, his government was characterized by white minority rule, systemic racial segregation, and suppression of black majorities' political and civil rights, obviously. The regime's refusal to transition into majority rule culminated in a protracted liberation war, leading to significant loss of life, infrastructure, etc., which we saw in the later days of his rule. Now, to give you a bit of perspective, you know that in as much as some white people in Britain opposed the idea of black people being liberated from white minority rule in Africa and obviously the rest of the world, there still was a multitude of white people who did not see black people as a capable people to take any charge of their own country. It was like asking your daughter to go live on her own, and she's only 3 years old. But sadly, this ideology is not alienated from today's world. There is still a big number of white people who don't think that blacks have what it takes to run a country. Now, let's pause for a minute. It is important to know that Smith, when he was a young leader after attending Rhodes University in Grahamstown, which is now Makanda in South Africa, he stopped his studies in 1939 to go and join the Royal Air Forces while fighting in World War II as a fighter pilot. Now, he then came back to finish off his university in Southern Africa, and he joined the Federal Party. Now, this is where the story gets a bit interesting. So by 1958, Ian Smith had become chief government whip to the parliament. But when the Federalists, which was the main government at that time, supported the new constitution, which was allowing black representation or Africans in parliament, Ian Smith could not take it. So Smith went on to deflect from the main party and founded his own Rhodesian Front in 1961. And this blew up in Rhodesia because it was resonating with a lot of white supremacists. So it was promising independence from Britain and telling them, you know, they can always go and do whatever they want, but he was not going to let Rhodesia go. So obviously his party won surprisingly because of his manifesto, because he was promising that, you know what, we're going to clean off these streets of black people. They're going to be segregated. We're going to live as the white minority in a lavish lifestyle without blacks in the streets. So his party took victory in 1962. And you see, somehow I think hate can actually propel some people to do better things. Now, the biggest question is, what did Smith do to the black people in the country? You don't want to know. So In 1964, Smith's first official act was to authorize the arrest of 4 black nationalists. Now, this was not the only move that he did. He went on to persecute black people in a very, very gruesome way. I'm talking about unaliving thousands upon thousands of people, and people actually disappearing in the middle of the night. And when the Commonwealth invited him to draft a favorable constitution in Zimbabwe, he raised his middle finger to the Queen and to the rest of the liberals, asking the liberation of black people. Now, November 11, 1965, Smith unilaterally declared Rhodesia's independence, which is referred to Unilateral Declaration of Independence, UDI. Great Britain refused to accept that Rhodesia was an independent state, but Great Britain refused the independence of Rhodesia, mainly because it was a source of wealth for the Commonwealth. And at Britain's request, economic sanctions against Rhodesia were applied by the UN Security Council. Now, this is the part I like discussing the most. The issue of sanctions against Smith compared to the sanctions currently on Zimbabwe are quite different. So here's a short list of sanctions on Smith. So he had a ban on import of Rhodesian goods such as sugar, tobacco, chrome, and additionally Rhodesia was expelled from the Sterling area, restricting its access to the British financial markets. And it also enforced an oil embargo, and the British government initiated the Beira Patrol in March 1966, which was deploying the Royal Navy squadron to prevent oil shipments from reaching Rhodesia via the Portuguese port of Beira in Mozambique. But here comes the United States of America. So the US obviously is a willing participant in sanctioning. So the US government urged American companies to find alternative sources of products like chrome. I'm pretty sure chrome was one of the major products that were exported from Rhodesia. And when they imposed these controls on exports from Rhodesia and Smith, I want to let you listen very carefully. Ian Smith came up with the brilliant idea to have what they called the program called the sanction busting program. So he opened a streamline of companies that were meant to safeguard the country from falling from these sanctions that were coming over. So he started companies that were actually for sanction busting. So he came up with different companies, and he was using cheap labor from the black Africans, of course, and the companies were giving the country a lot of money. In fact, they say the country grew even better than it was before, which then meant that Smith was a genius when it comes to economic decisions. Maybe, perhaps, I agree with people who said Smith was better, but in what terms? Because there's always a side to look at. There is the economic side, and then there is the political side. And clearly, the economic side was good, but for who? Obviously, the white minority. But although, this whole sanction busting from America was put in place, there was also some drawbacks that they did as the American people. So they came back to the table and said, you know what, we cannot sanction certain products from Rhodesia, and chrome was part of that, and this was called the Byrd Amendment. So despite the general embargo in 1971, the US Congress passed the Byrd Amendment, allowing import of Rhodesian chrome ore, citing anti-communist considerations. See, Americans are smart when they're doing things. When they realize that the quality of a natural resource in a certain country cannot be, sourced elsewhere, they try by all means to use communist ideology and anti-communist ideologies about it. They bring in Russia to say we cannot take from Russia because we need this product. So they restored chrome because they thought this was an exception. Now, see, this leads to the question, what was the life of an ordinary black man under Smith's regime? So under Ian Smith's regime, the black majority faced systemic racial discrimination and segregation, obviously akin to apartheid in South Africa. Now, the government structure prioritized the rights and privileges of white minority, relegating black Africans to a subordinate status, obviously. Now, political and social disenfranchisement, limited political activities and representation of black people. They were largely excluded from meaningful political participation. It was only a small fraction that was permitted to vote, and even then, only candidates approved by the white minority could run for an office. To be fair with you, I want to be very honest with you. I think the white minority in Zimbabwe back then, in Rhodesia, understood the concept of controlled democracy. And for some reason, I tend to agree that there are certain individuals that are not supposed to vote. I'll give you a context. In current Zimbabwe right now, there are people who would be given a piece of chicken or a box of chicken in to go and vote for the wrong party. And they do, because they don't understand the concept of politics and representative politics. So, at the end of the day, there are people who are not eligible to think properly, and democracy doesn't count logic, it counts heads. Hence, I agree, and solely I'm pro-democracy and all that, but there are certain individuals that are supposed to be kept away from the ballot box because they make our life a living hell. Anyway, let us go ahead with the lives of black majorities in Rhodesia. Now, they had to make sure that there was minority rule and there was suppression of political empowerment of black people. And obviously in urban areas, for example in Salisbury, which is now called Harare, there was racial segregation even in certain streets. If you were black and you were caught in First Street, you were unalived right on point, because there was no sign of a black person who was seen roaming around certain neighborhoods. Black Africans were prohibited from residing in areas designated for Europeans, and were restricted also from accessing facilities and services in those zones. There were even, written benches that secluded black people from sitting or from being in those areas. So this segregation extended to public amenities, education, healthcare. We're talking about creating a system where blacks had to use separate, often inferior facilities. That was the life of black people during Smith's regime. So you have to understand that there was also economic exploitation and labor inequalities. So the economy was structured to benefit the white minority. Black Africans constituting a labor underclass, obviously they were involved in low-paying manual jobs with limited opportunities for advancement. Obviously, the economic policies ensured that the wealth and resources remained concentrated within white communities, perpetuating economic disparities. Now, there was also a legal and judicial discrimination. Oh my God. In colonial Africa, there was nothing as biased as the judicial system or the justice system. The legal systems were skewed in the favor of white people. Black Africans faced presumptive bias, resulting in harsher penalties and unjust treatment, especially in cases that were involving white individuals. Now, this systemic bias eroded trust in legal institutions and perpetuated racial injustice. Now, let's be fair. The summary of this is that the life of a black man under Ian Smith's regime was characterized by systemic oppression and a gruesome way of dealing with politics and social justice. And obviously social disenfranchisement. The policies were mirrored obviously those of South Africa, which was a neighbor. That is why up to date it's so hard for you to speak of the history of Zimbabwe without mentioning South Africa, because these were like cousins who had kept the grip on black societies. So the black majority was marginalized in their own homeland. But saying all this, the difference was kind of like the same when the black government came into place. Now, this is the post-independence leadership, 1980 obviously to present. Zimbabwe attained its independence obviously in 1980, ushering in the majority rule under leaders such as Robert Mugabe and more recent Emmerson Dambudzo Mnangagwa, my G. So the early years post-independence saw commendable achievements, including expanded access to education and healthcare for the black majority. Obviously, efforts towards land distribution aimed at addressing colonial era inequalities. Zimbabwe had become free again. But let me pause it for now. There were challenges that emerged, notably economic mismanagement, corruption, human rights violations, and obviously the big elephant in the room, the land reform program of the 2000s. While addressing the historical injustice, this led to the decline of the agricultural productivity and the economic instability in Zimbabwe. So we saw that Zimbabwe started having an financial instability post the white minority rule and post Ian Smith. Why was that, and why is it important for us to point that out? It's because when the leaders that came into place took over the reins from the white minority, they even admitted that they don't know what they were doing. I have it on record when the vice president of Zimbabwe even said, we were given a country and we had no idea on how to run the country. I think I have a clip about that.
We got our political independence, but the white men never gave us the knowledge of how to run the economy. Angithi, ngoba zange singene esikole ukuthi siyofunda khona lokho. Saba lama bottle store, saba lama general dealer. That was it. Nothing more than that. We did not know ukuthi ngawulima you have got to test the soil. Abazange basifundise.
So the Smith regime maintained a relatively stable economy despite sanctions, primarily benefiting the white minority. In contrast, the post-independent Zimbabwe has faced hyperinflation, currency instability, and economic sanctions impacting the broader population. And now, ladies and gentlemen, I understand that the Smith regime was gruesome, it was bad, it was evil. But what I can say is there was good that came from the Smith regime, and obviously there was good that came with the black government. For example, I would say right now, to be fair, I can get into Zimbabwe, start up a business, I can do something, at least start or try something in Zimbabwe. It may fail because of bad leadership, but I'm free to start, which was not granted in Smith's regime. So I understand the need for you to want Ian Smith. I do, because you feel so stuck with these bad leaders. But there is nothing to wish for the black person to be put under the yoke of burden that Ian Smith put us under. That era is past us and the whole world has moved on. But we do have better leaders in Zimbabwe. We do have great, very, very leaders with acumen and the dexterity to move things forward. But they are blocked by the bad leaders, the ones that are leading the country. So ladies and gentlemen, I'm not asking you to consider this as a fact, but the Smith regime was nowhere close to good for the average black person, because you need to sit down with those who have actually been subjected under the rule of Smith regime. But however, when people are raising these issues, they're not raising them because they wish white people could come back and put us back into the bondage. They're saying it so that you understand how bad you have run the country. It's nothing to do with wanting the achievements or wanting what Smith did for the country. Most of these people who are saying these are young people that didn't even live under Smith's regime. However, these things need us to have a closer look at why people are even raising these comparisons. Smith's regime was marked by racial oppression, denial of political rights to the majority, while post-independent leaders established a majority rule. Obviously, there was political repression, corruption, human rights abuses, That is actually the same as Smith, but the only difference is it's now being done by a black man. And obviously the concerns about Zimbabwe right now are that, when are we going to have a break about this? At least the Zimbabweans in Ian Smith's time would go back home and have a plate of food. I don't know. This is a very, very hard topic to raise. But to be fair with you, I think this is a wake-up call for the leadership of Zimbabwe to realize the current affairs of Zimbabwe as of November 2017 have actually become a complex socio-economic and political conundrum. The government has launched new land policies, wanting to empower black people, trying to do all sorts of things, but they're not helping the people. We need to have an honest conversation about our country. What is our country doing for its local citizens? What is that you have gained from this country? What is it besides having a black majority government? What is it that we have gained as a people besides us doing corrupt means of, doing business, us corrupting the institutions? Right now, go into any institution, there's no civil servant who wants to work without you giving them money from your pocket. Is that what we call a progressive government? And I do understand people who are saying Smith's regime was better, but there can never be justification of the subjugation of people based on their race, color of their skin, their gender, or whatever ethnic origin they have. It's important to understand that these are evils of the same nature. We have a black leader who is still suppressing the rights of your liberties. Now, after everything, we need to ask ourselves the question, who was better, Ian Smith or the black majority government? And I find it so hard to compare the disparities between these two entities. But I can assure you one thing, they're both evils of different nature, I can say. During Smith's regime, we had people having efficient transport system. We had people having a decent life. Housing was provided. I mean, you had no normal rights to those of white people. They lived in better societies. They lived in better communities. Yet we do have as well people right now who would use their ethnic origins. Oh, I'm Karanga, therefore I'm going to create opportunities for the Karanga people. Oh, I'm Zezuru, I have to create opportunities for the Zezuru people. Right now as we speak, Emerson Mnangagwa's government right now as we speak is nepotistic. Right now as we speak, the children are put in the front, whilst everyone else is not important. The key ministries have been given to his homeboys. So what is the difference between Ian Smith and Mnangagwa? Let's be fair and let's be honest. It's the same idea and ideology, but just implemented by a man with a black skin. I'm not saying Smith was the best. Believe you me, I'm not saying Smith was the best. But when we are looking at governance, we are looking at the broader view, the bigger picture. How is the country run? When you keep milking from the poor, when you grab everything. See, I know Robert Mugabe was not a good guy. Robert Mugabe did his bad things, but there is no record of Robert Mugabe actually being as greedy as grabbing each and every mineral into his pocket, grabbing each and every opportunity to run for his own family. But current affairs in Zimbabwe right now, as of November 2017, it's so dire. It seems like we are back in Smith's regime, but we are free people in mental captivity or in ideological captivity. You can't protest. First ever, Mugabe used to have large protests, and yes, he could thump people for protesting, but there was a room for people to protest. But now in Zimbabwe, any word of you protesting, trust me, they'll knock on your door. And guess who did that? The same approach. Ian Smith. Ian Smith did not give you the liberties to go out and protest. He did not give you the liberties to air out your views. So tell me something. Is there any difference between a black majority rule and a white minority rule? I'm talking about current terms. The advantage of being in this government is that I can go and participate in the economy, well, provided I have certain amounts of money, because those opportunities are not given by the government, because those opportunities are for the elites. They are for the children of the president and the children of the ministers. So a normal person like me, an ordinary person from Zimbabwe, cannot come and get into the economic system or try to participate in the macroeconomy, because the government is not providing a conducive environment for ideas to flourish. I'm not saying this because I want to criticize, but I'm trying to give you a comparison of the Smith regime and the current regime. They will say, oh, we gave land to the people in Zimbabwe. Yes, you got land. Bravo, congratulations. But let's be honest, almost 80% of land right now is owned by the bourgeoisies of Zimbabwe right now. And most of them actually are foreigners, Chinese, for example. So eventually, we want our independence. You are able to go and start a podcast. You're able to go up. You're not able to go and start a podcast willy-nilly and speak the things that I'm talking about. You can go and start something else because you're not allowed. There are no freedoms. Then there is no freedom to protest. There is no freedom to air out your views. So it's more like the same coin of different sides. Sam Smith of different skin color. Until next time, ladies and gentlemen, thank you for watching this video and thank you for subscribing. Until next time.